Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode of All Things Investigation. I'm absolutely thrilled to have back Jeremy Painter and Diego Duran de la Vega, who are going to talk to us about three significant FinCEN enforcement actions that have been recent released. So, gentlemen, first of all, welcome to the podcast and welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be back.
So we've got the Banco, Vector, and Intercam enforcement actions. And I guess maybe we could start with, why do you all think these cases matter so much at this point under this administration?
If I may start, Tom, and I'll use the same line we used in a very recent client alert. This represents an existential threat for financial institutions doing business in Mexico. And I want to throw that out.
Wow.
Yeah, I know it's a bum, but it's true. And we'll walk you through why we think that is the case. And more concerning, we don't see the financial institutions subject to these type of actions being worried enough. But I'll take it several steps back, because it's key to understand why and what these designations mean. And to understand that, we need to place them within the right context. And that right context is the fentanyl crisis. I think no one denies that there's an issue with fentanyl. It's the leading cause of death for Americans between 18 and 45 years old. So there's definitely something that the US government needs to be doing. And one of the things it's doing is trying to address it from a law enforcement perspective or a regulatory enforcement perspective. And so we've seen, beginning just this year, the foreign terrorist organization designations. We've talked about that in the past. We saw the tweaks and redirectioning of the FCPA, so that the focus is on activity related to drug cartels. We saw an interesting focus on OFAC actions, which my partner Jeremy will talk more about. There's interesting data coming out of those. And now, what we will be talking about today, the very recent FinCEN designations as money laundering concerns of three Mexican financial institutions. Another thing to say, which is really interesting, is this is a first for various reasons. It's the first time that a law that was recently created is used in this context. And I'm talking about the Fend Off Fentanyl Act, which was enacted back in April of 2024. So it's interesting. It's a Biden-era law, right? But it's for the first time being used in this context by the Trump administration. And important to understand that this law it's a sanctions and anti-money laundering law designed to disrupt the financial networks of these criminal organizations. So that's basically what it means in a nutshell, what it does. It's also the first time that three financial institutions are being designated by FinCEN at the same time. In the past, we've seen similar actions, not exactly the same, but because again, this is the first time that FinCEN is using this specific authority provided by the Fend Off Fentanyl Act. But in similar actions, designations, FinCEN has never targeted three different financial institutions belonging to three different economic groups. And so by targeting Cibanco, Intercam, and Vector this time, it's also a first that I think gives a lot to talk about. Historically, FinCEN has issued 34 actions like this one, including the Cibanco, the latest ones. But what's interesting, if you see the list as we have, you will see that most of those actions target financial institutions that come from very high-risk jurisdictions. And I'm talking about Syria, Iraq, Myanmar, countries like that. And that goes to the last point I want to share right now, which is all these different things that I listed at the beginning, the FTO designations, the redirecting of FCPA, the focus of actions, the recent FinCEN designations of money laundering concerns, they somehow importantly target Mexico as a jurisdiction. We started again in January, February with the foreign terrorist organization designations. And so we've seen the US really trying to use every single tool in the toolkit to target, again, what they're trying to address, the fentanyl crisis. And it's relevant that most of the things that they've done really have a focus on Mexico. 6 of the 8 foreign terrorist organization designations are related to Mexican drug cartels. Part of those 6, you got the Salvadoran Mara, Salvatrucha, and then the Tren de Agua from Venezuela. But the rest, it's Mexico. And if you look at the map, like a heat map, it's all across the country. Between those 6 designated drug cartels, you can paint the whole country in all their colors. So this is relevant because now Mexico has become a much higher risk jurisdiction for companies doing business in that jurisdiction.
Jeremy, you have been an OFAC investigator. Do we need to walk Diego back from the ledge? Is this an existential crisis? Can we take any, not maybe comfort, but guidance from these enforcement actions that banks or other institutions subject to OFAC would look towards for lessons learned?
Yeah, it is existential, as Diego said, for reasons that we'll explain, but just to preface it, the risk is that the effect is immediate. Just like an OFAC designation action, there's no pre-warning, right? It just, boom, happens, and the legal effect is de facto, not de jure, so not as a matter of law immediate, but as a matter of practical fact, it is immediate, Tom. As far as the focus on Mexico, as a former OFAC targeter, I pay very close attention to what OFAC is focusing on. And a lot of times, particularly recently, rhetoric doesn't quite match actual government actions, right? I like numbers and facts to support things. And so there have been almost 700 OFAC designation actions under the Trump administration. So since January 20th of this year, to be exact, it's 677, but for about 700. And almost half, or a bit more than half rather, of those actions targets Iran oil and or petrochemical actors, right? So these are buyers and brokers and shippers and freight forwarders, anybody who touches Iranian oil. That's half of all of the sanctions actions. So putting those aside, 25% of the remaining OFAC designation actions are against Mexican companies and individuals in Mexico. As a former OFAC targeter, I can tell you that is an extraordinary laser-like focus on Mexico. That kind of focus on Mexico is beyond unprecedented. And the reason that matters from a compliance perspective is that OFAC has been, not just OFAC, the whole of government, the whole of US government has been explicit in its position that the cartels control a lot of Mexican industry. There's been lots of statements about the cartel's involvement in politics and the government itself. That's critical. And people that Diego and I know and trust that are on the ground in Mexico have told us that they're telling their clients that between 20 and 30% of businesses in Mexico are directly or indirectly tied to one of these designated Mexican cartels that Diego referenced. And so that is why that context is really important to consider when we talk about these recent FinCEN actions against Banco, Vector, and Intercom, because it's part of a whole of government approach that is singularly focusing on Mexico.
But this didn't come out of nowhere. The government has clearly signaled since literally January 21, this was either coming or going to happen. Even if it's a refocus of U.S. efforts, should really anyone be surprised at the, I don't want to say ferocity, but the speed at which this has happened?
Let me just jump in very quick. I can guarantee you that no one in Mexico was expecting what happened with Cibanco, Vector, and Intercam. It caught everyone by surprise. They were thinking about the foreign terrorist organization designations. You know, people are sophisticated enough in Mexico understand sanctions, but a FinCEN action like this wasn't in anyone's radar. It took everyone by surprise, especially these three financial institutions. And the concern is that, and I know you're going to ask this question, Tom. Sorry for stealing the thunder from under you, but is FinCEN going to keep handing out actions like this? Are they going to keep designating more financial institutions operating in Mexico? I'll turn it to the expert, Jeremy, but the quick and not so sweet is that yes, that's the expectation.
So I can tell you FinCEN's, so Diego has lots of experience in Mexico dealing directly with these Mexican companies and banks. I do not, but my expertise and experience is with the US government's perspective, right? And from FinCEN's perspective, these actions did not fall out of nowhere, right? The US government's perspective, and we'll get into this later on as to lessons learned, Tom, but FinCEN's take on this is that they should not have been surprised, right? These three financial institutions should have known that this was coming. And as far as more to come, yes, more to come. I've been told that this legal authority will be used again, but their lesson learned, FinCEN's lesson learned, that is they will never do three again, three simultaneously. It just overwhelmed them. They worked day and night for weeks after the action was announced to try to straighten things up. And so on the compliance side, more to come, but not three at once. That I can assure you will not happen.
One thing I did want to raise is the role of China, because in the either traditional press or at least non-legal press, I saw much more ink about the role of China in this. Could one of you all talk a little bit about how China plays into this? I guess we have to talk about national security, but also trade policy and perhaps even other factors.
I'll start from a Mexico perspective, Tom, and perhaps more than China, Chinese companies. It's basically where the whole scheme starts, according to the U.S. government, because that's where the precursors to fentanyl come from, and are allegedly they're shipped to Mexico, where they're processed and then moved to the north border, and that's how they get into the U.S. Specifically, going back to the recent FinCEN designations, what FinCEN is alleging in these designations is that these three financial institutions had clients or transactions went through their platforms, the bank systems that relate to companies from China, transactions with companies from China, and that they could pinpoint directly towards illicit activity in connection with drug cartels. And if you read the three separate documents that FinCEN made public about the recent designations, you'll see that basically the common denominator is these three financial institutions. They listed a bunch of transactions that they identified as problematic. They all had to do with, for the majority part, with transactions related to Chinese companies. So answering to your questions, maybe not about the Chinese government, is that's where you were going to, but Chinese companies definitely are part of what the U.S. is looking at, and the way they interact with Mexican companies, the way they interact with the Mexican financial system, and how they eventually get the product up and launder money.
Actually, that's relatively easy because the U.S. government considers a Chinese company a part of the Chinese government. So we don't even have to have that interesting political philosophical discussion. Right. Jeremy, what is the legal authority here, and how is it maybe different, or was it used differently in your opinion?
Yeah, so the legal authority, if you want to look it up, Tom, it's 21 U.S.C. 2313A, which is the Fend Off Fentanyl Act that Diego was referencing at the top. And it is very similar to Section 311 of the Patriot Act, which you may be familiar with, which is basically FinCEN's sanctions authority. It's different in a very important way in that it authorizes FinCEN to go straight to a final order, which means there's no notice of proposed rulemaking, no comment period, which means that there's no opportunity for the designated financial institution to kind of plead its case in front of Treasury. It's a death notice, and so that's an important distinction. Secondarily, there's an added what OFAC, or excuse me, what FinCEN refers to as a special measure. It's referred to as Special Measure 6 in this case, and that authorizes U.S. Treasury to prohibit any funds transmittal involving these sanctioned banks. And the point of that particular prohibition is to kill a bank or a non-bank, but a financial institution, right? Because we'll get into the definition of financial institution, but the point is so that this order is an unequivocal immediate death sentence of a company. And so in those ways, it's similar but different than the 311 action, and has immediate consequential effects.
That's why I was saying, Tom, I didn't mean to be very dramatic or exaggerated, but that's why there's an existential threat in all of this. If you are a financial institution doing business in Mexico and you haven't been dotting your I's and crossing your T's from a compliance perspective, specifically anti-money laundering angle, you have significant risk you didn't have prior to 2025.
What's the jurisdiction over a Mexican bank from the U.S. government? I certainly understand an enforcement action, but how could they enforce it?
You mind, Diego?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so as a matter of law, Tom, the prohibition applies to U.S. financial institutions, not the sanctioned Mexican banks, as a matter of law. Okay? So U.S. banks are prohibited from dealing in any funds transmitted to, from, or involving these sanctioned banks. So what that does is completely sever off the banks from the U.S. financial system, which is a death sentence because no financial institution can operate without access, direct or indirect, to the U.S. dollar. It's the same with sanctions, with economic sanctions administered and enforced by OFAC. It's the same legal foundation that is only applicable to U.S. companies and banks.
Diego, what should companies and or banks be doing in response to these actions? Or what advice maybe have you given clients or put out in a client alert?
What we've found is something very distressing, which is there's a lot of financial institutions that they're not even aware they could be on the hook. And that goes to what Jeremy was pointing towards, which is the definition of financial institution, which for purposes of what can FinCEN do and who can block from the US financial system is very broad. And it not only includes banks. That's why we were being very careful how we refer to these as financial institutions, not banks, because it includes banks, it includes not bank financial institutions, it includes casinos, it includes exchange houses, it includes even insurance companies. A lot of types of businesses could fall within the financial institution definition that FinCEN uses to target these entities. And what we've encountered is that the first step is financial institutions, broadly defined, need to fully understand what's going on. They need to determine if they are on the hook or not, or they could be on the hook under this expansive definition. And then, obviously, there's several steps, which starts by asking the question, have you heard anything from FinCEN or the US government in general about your money laundering compliance program or issues they could have found? No? Okay, then we move to the next question. Have you heard anything from the Mexican government about issues with money laundering? Okay, what about negative media? Have you checked for that? How have you dealt with that? And you keep asking until you get to the last point, which is, okay, so you haven't heard anything? Great. You still need to do something, which is you need to hire a professional, someone who understands what needs to be done, and you need to make sure that your current compliance program, as it relates to anti-money laundering, is up to speed and fully complies with what we're seeing right now in the US, specifically what FinCEN is doing and how could they get in their crosshairs. That's what they need to be doing. And again, to our dismay, they seem to be waiting for something to really start addressing this very critical situation. We don't want to be alarmist, but there's a huge risk. And I can tell you, financial institutions, those who understand that they could be in the same shoes as Cibanco, Intercam, and Vector, they are concerned. They're trying to figure out what to do. They're not entirely sure what needs to be done, and they're still in the process of retaining U.S. legal counsel for that. But there's no question, they need to do something to address this, because there's going to be a next one, and no one wants to be the next Cibanco, the next Vector, or the next Intercam.
Let me ask you guys, I don't have experience in Mexico, but I do have experience in Brazil. We are in Brazil. Our company is in Brazil. They cannot touch us. They cannot extradite anyone. Yeah, I may lose a little money, but why can't I do business in the EU? Why can't I do business with China? There are multiple other financial sectors across the world. How do you have that discussion to convince them they are at risk?
Yeah, so I'm having that right now with Brazilian financial institutions and non-bank companies, Tom, in relation to the Brazilian judge that Trump recently had sanctioned through OFAC. And Brazil is starting to understand better its connections to the U.S. financial its connections to the U.S. financial system, right? But it doesn't quite get how this jurisdictional hook that we discussed works. The Mexican companies and banks are far more sophisticated in that understanding. So we're beyond that stage, luckily, in explaining the significance of having access to the U.S. financial system. Brazil's not there yet. They're getting there, and I'm doing my best to help Brazil get there. And again, this particular sanction against the judge is a helpful illustration. It brought everything to the forefront. But luckily, we're a couple of steps beyond that in our discussions with Mexican banks and companies.
So what lessons are you able to communicate, or are companies and or banks, financial institutions, or really anyone handling cash, can they draw from this trio of enforcement actions?
Tom, the first thing is that banks really need to be looking at FinCEN alerts. You mentioned previously about the connection between the fentanyl trade in China and Mexico. And FinCEN has been painting this picture for a while through its alerts. A year before these three Mexican financial institutions were sanctioned under this new authority, and put out an advisory about the procurement of precursor chemicals and manufacturing equipment. And FinCEN did a great job of identifying 2 pages of red flags. And now many of these red flags are very specific to the facts relevant to these 3 financial institutions. So the first obvious lesson learned is don't ignore FinCEN when it puts out an advisory. It will act. And I can say from my experience working at Treasury on related issues, to take an action almost exactly a year after an advisory was put out was done with great thought. In other words, they wanted to wait until it had been out for a year. The activity hadn't stopped. The warnings had been made publicly and privately. And so they took action. So that's the first action. Secondly, for non-banks, I think it's really important for non-banks to consider now their adverse media screening component in their controls. Because a lot of the issues that Diego and I have been discussing relative to cartel affiliation or fentanyl dealings are going to be first brought to the attention of not only other banks, but the US government through negative news. And so a lot of companies, even sophisticated companies, don't have proper means to interdict, escalate, and have record keeping around those negative news screening results. It just kind of goes into the ether. And so that's an important consideration. For banks, banks really need to ensure that they quickly respond to any RFI that other banks give them. Many banks pass requests for information back and forth so they can better assess their risk. And so when one bank sits on requests for information that it receives from another bank, the transmitting bank will send a SAR, suspicious activity report, into FinCEN and say, hey, we've been asking questions about these accounts in Mexico and we're not getting responses. That will get FinCEN's attention. And lastly, for banks and non-banks, they really need to ensure that there's proper communication between their compliance function and their legal function. Because when Diego mentioned that one of the first questions that we're asking companies in Mexico is whether or not the US government, the Mexican government, or any of their banks have knocked on their door asking questions, their reflexive response is no one's asked, right? It's important for companies not to just accept that without a little bit of a soft touch investigation to ensure that's the case, because in many large companies, as I'm sure you know well, Tom, in many large companies, it's difficult for it to know what the left hand is doing. And that led to a lot of the problems that these banks had, was just a ignorance between the compliance and legal functions. So bringing them together, making sure that communication is flowing back and forth is really critical.
Diego, can I ask you to maybe look down the road and ask you, how do you see, or what do you see portended, or maybe down in offerings from OFAC based upon what you saw in these three enforcement actions?
So what we're seeing down the line is we're not expecting FinCEN to just, sit down and rest with these three. We think that they laid the ground for potential subsequent actions, very similar to the ones we just saw. They don't necessarily need to be related to Mexico. Remember that these cartels and two other foreign terrorist organizations recently designated, operate in other Latin American countries. But it really doesn't need to be in connection with a designated entity. It could be any entity trafficking and have a connection with fentanyl, illicit fentanyl trade and trafficking, and sending it to the US for them to be interested. And so it doesn't need to be a large bank. Cibanco was the 20th largest bank in Mexico. They were one of the largest fiduciary agents in the country. A lot of international companies, a lot of large Mexican companies had points of connection with Cibanco, mostly from a fiduciary agent perspective. But again, definitely not the top 10, maybe not even the top 20. It's barely the 20th largest bank in Mexico. And that meant they represent 1% of the amounts handled in the Mexican financial system, which roughly equates to 8 billion. So again, this is also a lesson. I think no one's safe. If a bank that size is going through this and it's basically killing it, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, it became public that their fiduciary arm, which again is their main business, got sold to another Mexican bank. That's basically a distressed asset sale type of situation we're looking at. That's why it's very grave what happened. And for financial institutions doing business in Mexico who are not see this as a cautionary tale and start doing what they need to be doing to protect against this risk, they're going to find themselves in a situation like this.
Well, now that I've listened to both of you, Diego, I think your comments on an existential crisis may actually be an understatement. Gentlemen, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Likewise, Tom. Always a pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank
Tom.
you.